So, welcome to the last class before the midterm. So, the midterm is on Monday. Well, let's talk about that right off the bat because I know you're all burning to know what's going on with that. So, please bring your student ID and a pencil. We will be checking your IDs, and you need a pencil to fill out a Scantron sheet, not a pen. It's Monday, July 4th. That is next Monday. It will not be in this room. So, this is too cheatable of a room. We got a bigger room. It'll be at the instructional building, room 120. So if you don't know where that is, it's not that far from here, but go there, not here. I'll put a note on the door just in case anybody doesn't get this message or forgets or whatever. And it will be 1 hour long, so which I hope should be plenty. I hope 1 hour should be more than enough for practically everybody. In any given test, there's always at least a few people who want to take the entire time, and that's perfectly fine. But I expect the majority of you will be done well before an hour. Yeah, question?
Will it be instructional or a lecture after?
No, there's no lecture after. I find that to be a cruel and absurd thing to try to do to people. I want you to use all your brain power on the midterm and then go home and be satisfied with your work. Yeah. What a mean thing to do to somebody. Yeah. Right. So there'll be 25 multiple choice questions and 2 argument analyses. So the 25 multiple choice are just one each. 1 point for getting the wrong answer, 0 points for getting, or 1 point for getting the right answer, 0 points for getting the wrong answer. So you don't get marks off for getting the wrong answer at least. So there's no negative marks anyway. And the 2 argument diagrams, I believe they're out of 6. I believe they're out of 6 each. And that'll be 2 points for identifying the premises and the conclusion. So I'll get you to list the premises. I'll have it written in like a block of text, and I'll have you write out the premises and the conclusion. So 2 for getting that right, and then 4 for drawing a diagram. And those will be about the level of complexity that you saw on Monday. So it's not going to be a big step up in the complexity of the diagrams that you're looking at. It'll be about the same as already done. So, and we'll do a couple more bits of practice today. Of slightly more complex ones, but they won't be mind-blowingly difficult. And those are going to be marked by hand by my good friend Michael, who will mark them with a generous hand and an open mind, so that if you give an answer that makes sense but maybe wasn't necessarily the answer we're looking for, he will mark that as correct. He's a smart guy, flexible, he can do that kind of thing. So, and then the day after the midterm, we'll go through all the multiple choice questions, and then we can argue about them. Where if you think you had an answer that was right, but I didn't mark it as right, we can negotiate that. If you convince me that your answer is as good as the one I gave you, then anybody who gives that answer will get the mark for it. Sound fair? Yeah, that's my fail-safe for, like, it's happened a number of times in this course already where I thought I knew the answer, and then the collective intelligence of the room showed me that there was at least another answer, if not a better answer than the one I gave. So I wouldn't be shocked. I tried my best to give questions with one and only one correct answer. I wouldn't be shocked if there was at least one in that 25 multiple choice questions where there's more than one correct answer that I didn't see. So we'll see. Okay, any further questions about that? The multiple choice questions are questions that you should be reasonably familiar with. I think there's 1 or 2 definition things. Oh, sorry, yes, also aids. You're allowed to bring paper dictionaries. So if you bring a dictionary that's just made of paper, you can use that. I'm not interested in testing whether you know the meaning of words. That's not what this class is about. This is probably not relevant if you were born speaking English, but if you have English as your second language, that might be helpful. And it's not, yeah, this isn't an English class. I'm not testing whether you know the meaning of words. I'm testing whether you can analyze the quality of arguments. So paper dictionaries are allowed. We'll flip through them to check for any surreptitious notes, if you don't mind. But other than that, no other aids are allowed. So bring a pencil, a student ID, and a paper dictionary if you so desire. Okay? Okay. The content of the multiple choice. There's a few on like the concepts. So what is the meaning of this concept as I've explained it in this course? There's a few, I think there's only 1 or 2, like is this definition too narrow or too broad? So there's not a lot of that on the midterm. There's a few like is this analytic or synthetic, that kind of thing. So familiar style of questions, I hope. And I don't do trick questions. These are all questions that are supposed to be, if you've been paying attention, if you've been doing the work, you'll be able to answer them. So that sometimes bites me in the butt by producing too high of an average, but I'm happy if you guys all do well, that's great. It just means you'll slack off more as the course goes on. Get a false sense of confidence. Okay. Okay? Great. So we'll see you all on Monday at the instructional building, room 120. And there'll be, have been there already. I'll have laid out the exams. You'll sit at one of the exams and then write it. Okay. So for today, we're doing the chapter on reconstructing arguments. If you've been following along in the textbook, you'll notice that everything in this chapter is stuff that we've talked about already. So this chapter in the textbook is just about diagramming arguments, which we've been doing all along. I thought that in the way it's presented in the textbook, it comes too quickly and too suddenly. It just appears argument diagramming after they've made you memorize 7 different uses of language, then they throw argument diagramming at you in one chapter. I thought it would be better to kind of slowly work up to it. So I hope that's been effective. It means that the stuff in this chapter is stuff we've already covered. So what we're going to do basically is some sentential logic and then one more step in the ramping up the complexity of argument diagramming. So the basic concepts we're going to deal with today are the basic logical connectives, the sentential logical connectives. If you've done logic, modern symbolic logic, relax. This will be very, very easy for you. Kick back and enjoy. If you haven't done modern symbolic logic, this is the kind of very beginnings of that course. And I feel like on Monday we were talking about a lot of concepts. So the diagramming arguments sort of would be much improved by having these basic argument forms under your belt. So we're going to go over some basic argument forms, basic valid and invalid argument forms. We're not actually going to talk about deductive and inductive, well, a little tiny bit about deductive and inductive reasoning. I think we'll talk more about that after the midterm, but also we're going to talk a little bit about, this is the, number 4 here is the advanced argument diagramming stuff about removing things that aren't premises and adding in things that should be premises. We'll really just do removing things that aren't premises and rephrasing today, and we'll worry about adding missing premises as we move along into the more complex stuff. So the skills today are just identifying the argument patterns, doing some really, really basic inferences using them, and doing the second 2 are about the argument mapping, which is rephrasing things to match. And these are things, that's something we've been doing already, really. I've been kind of just fudging it. When I take a written argument and then break it down into premises, I've been changing them a little bit in the transition without really justifying why or explaining to you how or anything like that. So we'll focus on that explicitly and also striking out things that are non-premises. Okay, so let's do that. So starting with the logical connectives and valid argument forms. Really, we're just going to look at 4 logical connectives. So these things are called logical connectives. Usually they connect 2 sentences. So P and Q are sentences or propositions. They say something either true or false about the world. Conditionals we've seen already, if P then Q. Conjunctions, P and Q. Disjunctions, P or Q. A negation is also called a logical connective, even though it doesn't connect anything. This is just how logicians speak. They say it's a unary logical connective, which is a really bizarre phrase, but nonetheless, it's a thing that you can do to a sentence. When you say P is true, and then you negate it, what you're just saying is P is false. It's fairly straightforward. This stuff is fairly straightforward, but it helps to have it, I hope it'll help to have it in explicit abstract form. We've been dealing with this embedded in the normal speech so far, and now I'll be presenting it to you in explicitly abstract form so that you can see the form stripped of the content. Yeah? Okay. So the conditional is the weirdest one. The conditional is the most complicated of the logical connectives, in my opinion. Every other one of these is should be just so completely conceptually transparent to you that I'm more or less wasting your time by telling you about it, but nonetheless, I'm going to. But the parts of the conditional are important to learn, and if you learn the parts of the conditional, then you can easily identify the valid and invalid arguments that you can make based on it. So the first part of the conditional is called the antecedent or the antecedent. I've heard both ways of saying it. The antecedent is the part that says if it is blah, 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 so if something, and then the consequent is then something. So if it is raining, then the sidewalk is wet. The antecedent and the consequent. The weird part about conditionals is that the whole sentence can be true despite the fact that the antecedent and the consequent are both false. So the statement, if it is raining, then the sidewalk is wet, is true. It's true here today, despite the fact that it's a beautiful sunny day outside. So it is not raining, and the sidewalks are not wet, and nonetheless the conditional, if it is raining, then the sidewalk is wet, is true. Right? And furthermore, you can have conditionals where the antecedent is true and the consequent is true, yet the conditional is false. Right? So if it's just two things that are unconnected, right? So, if it is sunny, then the moon orbits the Earth. Those things are both true. Right now it's sunny outside and the moon is orbiting the Earth, but they're not connected in any interesting or important way. Right? It's not the case that if one is true, then the other is true. They're not conditional on each other. So the conditional says one thing conditions the truth of the other. Yeah? Analyzing the actual properties of a conditional is like an ongoing debate in philosophy. The logical properties of this thing are kind of weird. David Lewis analyzes it in terms of possible worlds. So if you want to know whether if it's raining, then the sidewalk is wet is true, you ask, in the nearest possible world where it is raining, is the sidewalk wet? So that gets us into talking about possible worlds, which are like other ways that the universe could be, which is fairly odd. But you don't have to worry about that for the purposes of this class. So that's the conditional. It's a great thing to know. And you can produce various arguments, valid and invalid arguments, using the conditional. And I'd like you to know the names of these things. Yeah, question?
Are we talking about if a statement, if an argument is true or false based on truth tables, or?
So I hadn't brought truth tables into it. So for those of you who haven't done PHL247, the truth table is like the following. So if you say P and Q, then what you do is say, so if P is true and Q is true, then the whole sentence is true. If P is false and Q is true, then the sentence is false. If P is false and Q is false, then this whole sentence is false. And if P is true and Q is false, then this whole sentence is false. So the truth table tells you, given the truth values of the two parts of the sentence, the two things that are connected by the logical connective, is the whole sentence true or false? We kind of want to avoid the truth table so here's the weird thing about the conditional. Say if P then Q, it's got a kind of weird truth table because if P is true and Q is true, then the whole thing is true, so that's good. If P is true and Q is false, then it's false. So that makes sense, right? So if P then Q, so if it's raining outside, then the sidewalks are wet, and it's raining outside and the sidewalks are wet, then that conditional was true. If it's raining outside and the sidewalks are not wet, then that conditional as a whole was false. And now it gets really weird, because if the antecedent is false, and this is false, then this conditional is true. And if the antecedent is false and this is true, then the conditional is true. So that gives you really bizarre sentences like, if I'm 10 feet tall, then the moon is made of green cheese, is true. Because anytime the antecedent is false, the whole sentence is true. This is a really weird property of conditionals as they're usually analyzed in symbolic logic. It gives you really weird results and that don't really match up with how we think about conditionals. So like, if I tell you if the sidewalks rain, so if I tell you if Canada is a country in the southern hemisphere, then blank, where blank is literally anything, then according to the symbolic logic way of treating conditionals, that's true. That sentence I just said is true, which is really weird, but there's not really any other way to build the truth table for the conditional, so it's just what we get stuck with, essentially. And there's a lot of debate about how to deal with cases where the antecedent is false. Don't worry about that for the purpose of this course. There's a whole literature on this that you needn't concern yourself with. Yeah, so that's why we're not doing truth tables, and why I'm not going to ask you like, is this conditional true? At no point will I present you with a weird conditional with a false antecedent and say, is this true? Because it's just bizarre and it doesn't match any way that people usually reason, right? So, like, here's an example of where it doesn't match the way you usually reason. If you touch the electric fence, you're going to get a shock. Well, if you didn't touch the electric fence and it was off, then that sentence is still true according to this analysis. So the electric fence is off, there's no power, you weren't going to get a shock even if you touched it, but because of the weird properties of the conditional as it's usually analyzed in logic, if you touch the electric fence, you're going to get a shock is true in any case where you didn't touch it. So that's a bizarre property. It's just a bizarre property of how this is formalized in symbolic logic. So don't worry about it, basically. Unless you take PHL247, in which case you should worry a lot about it, or you should pay great attention to it. Okay. For our purposes, we're really just going to consider valid and invalid argument forms without worrying about the truth tables. Okay? Okay. I'm glad I got to tell you about that weirdness, but I'm glad it's also not on the test. Okay, so, all right, so here's a valid argument form. If P then Q, P therefore Q. This is the standard syllogism, the standard thing called modus ponens. Again, I would like you to know the names of these things. It's helpful to know the names of these things. But try your best not to use these names on people. There's this really obnoxious thing that people do where they use philosophy speak in ordinary debates. And they say, oh, well, you're doing modus tollens here, and that should be modus ponens or something. And it's really not helpful. It's not nice. It's not polite, usually, unless you know that the other person knows the term. It's like you use Latin to just intimidate people. So I'm going to tell you the names so that you are not intimidated, but I would ask that you don't use them on people as a form of intimidation. All right, so standard syllogism, as you've seen a million times. And for all of these, I'll just show you a valid and sound version and a valid but unsound version. So one that makes good sense and one that doesn't make sense but is nonetheless a valid argument form. So all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Valid and sound, so the premises are true and they lead deductively to the conclusion. Exactly the same form, but unsound. If water is wet, then pigs will fly. Water is wet, therefore pigs will fly. This is also a valid argument, right? Right? So if I ask you, is this argument valid? You'll say, yes, of course it's valid. It's obviously valid. It's an example of modus ponens. It is unsound because the premises are untrue, but it's still valid. Good? Good. Right. Here's another valid argument form. If P then Q, not Q, therefore P. Right? Modus tollens, or denying the consequent. So recall that I just said moments ago, this is the antecedent, this is the consequent. So you say if P then Q, and then you say not Q. So Q is false. Therefore, P. So if this sentence is true, then it must be the case that P, no, it should be not P. Thank you. It should be not P. Of course it should be not P. Okay. That's so silly. There, fixed it. Okay. It's going to be messed up on the next slide as well. Right, so if P then Q, not Q, therefore not P. Because of course, anytime, if this first thing is true, if this conditional is true, and this is, by the way, this is why you don't split conditionals up into being two premises, right? So some people are tempted to say, if P then Q, and then take if P as one premise, and then Q as like the conclusion of the, like a sub-conclusion. You don't want to do that. You want to evaluate if P then Q as one premise, right? That it can be true or false all by itself as a whole. So if P then Q is true, assume that's true, and then assume that not Q is true. You can infer from that deductively that not P is true. Okay? And some examples. Once again, screwed up the slide. If it's raining, then the sidewalks are wet. The sidewalks are not wet, therefore it's not raining. Right? True premises, valid argument. It's a sound argument. Here's a valid but unsound version of this. If you just ignore the exam, it will go away. The exam happened, so it did not go away. Therefore, you did not ignore it. Okay, so if ignore exam, then it won't happen. But it happened, so not this. Therefore, not that. Perfectly valid inference, unsound premises. Okay. Straightforward. This should all feel just like so blindingly obvious that you can't believe that I'm telling you. But nonetheless, it's worth our while, I hope, to go through these. Because being able to spot these within an argument helps you structure it, helps you see whether the premises are dependent or independent, and whether it's a valid or invalid argument. Right. So this is an invalid argument form. This is not a valid argument. Unlike modus tollens, the one we just saw, if P then Q, Q, therefore P. An invalid argument form. So here's examples of these. All dogs have hair. I have hair. Therefore, I'm a dog. So two true premises leading to an obviously false conclusion. Here's a plausible sounding one that I think I showed you before. All actors are vain. Tom Cruise is vain. Therefore, Tom Cruise is an actor. That should strike you as like it sounds plausible, but not quite right. Right? Ah, that's nice. Ooh. Okay, everybody let your eyes adjust briefly. Okay. Good so far? Good. Another one, chain argument, or sometimes also called a hypothetical syllogism. But because the textbook calls it a chain argument, we'll call it a chain argument. If P then Q, if Q then R, therefore if P then R, you should be able to see how this is fairly, like you can see how this is valid. So if the test is long, you'll be tired at the end. If you're tired, you'll have trouble focusing. So if the test is long, you'll have trouble focusing. Valid and sound. If water is wet, then pigs will fly. If pigs will fly, then it is the end of days. Therefore, if water is wet, it is the end of days. Perfectly valid, but unsound. Okay? Good. Okay. Another form of so this is I didn't include it in the list of basic connectives, but it's another one that you could think about, the biconditional. So P if in it, only if Q, Q therefore P. And this is really just two conditionals stuck together. So if you say, if P then Q, and if Q then P, that's equivalent to saying P biconditional Q. And this just says, so this says anytime that P is true, Q must be true, and anytime that Q is true, P must be true, and vice versa. So if P is true, Q is true. If P is false, Q is false. Right? It's just two conditionals stuck together. So if you have P, you can infer Q, and if you have Q, you can infer P. That's a biconditional. So I didn't include this in the basic list because it's really just two conditionals going opposite ways stuck together. So if and only if it's raining, then the sidewalk is wet. The sidewalk is not wet, therefore it's not raining. It's the same one as the invalid argument form from before, right? So if you say, if it's raining, then the sidewalk's wet, the sidewalk is not wet, therefore it's not raining, or sorry, the sidewalk is wet, therefore it's raining, that's a incorrect inference. But if you say, if and only if, then you can infer either from the other, right? You can infer the truth value of one from the other straightforwardly. Here's another way of making this argument that was invalid valid. All and only actors are vain. Tom Cruise is vain. Therefore, Tom Cruise is an actor. That's a valid argument now, right? You can't do it. You cannot go from the truth of the consequent to the truth of the antecedent. But if you have a biconditional, then they go both ways. Yeah? Okay. Yeah?
The exception to that would be chain arguments. I guess where we shove in another premise and then you make that jump.
Why would that be an exception? So chain argument goes if P then Q, if Q then R. So what are you suggesting is, so if one of these is a biconditional, or?
Like actors are vain,
Yeah.
and then Tom Cruise is an actor. And I guess his intermediary premise would be like something like only actors are vain or something that implies that connection.
Right, right.
Like,
I'm not sure what you're, so.
like, I guess could you get the same effect?
From a chain argument? No, so from a chain argument, so you can't say so if P then Q, if Q then R, you can't go backwards in a chain argument and say if R then P, right? If so, all actors are vain, and all vain people own big mirrors, then you can infer that all actors own big mirrors, but you cannot infer that all people who own big mirrors are actors. But if these were both biconditionals, then you could go backwards from R to Q and then from Q to B. Okay? Good. Good. Isn't it? Right. Conjunctions and disjunctions. Okay, now we're into the really easy stuff. This should be so easy that you cannot believe it. So if you have P and Q, you can conclude P or Q. So I am human and male, therefore I'm human. If it is warm out and the earth is flat, or it is warm out and the earth is flat, therefore the earth is flat. This is just simplification. So the statement P and Q tells you that both P is true and Q is true. So you can infer either from that statement. Any of you having trouble with the word and? I bet you didn't expect anybody to explain the word and to you today, but here you are, paying for the privilege of having the word and explained to you. All right. The disjunctive syllogism, though, is slightly more complex, I suppose. So if you have either P or Q, and you know not P, you can conclude Q. We talked about this on Monday. So either I'm wearing shoes or I'm wearing sandals. I'm not wearing sandals, therefore I'm wearing shoes. Valid and sound. Either the world is ending or I have a terrible hangover. I don't have a hangover, therefore the world is ending. Valid but unsound. Fortunately, the world will persist, at least until Monday, I'm sorry to say. Okay. So arguments that follow one of those patterns perfectly can be considered deductively valid. That is, the truth of the premises absolutely guarantees the truth of the conclusion. There are a lot more deductively valid argument patterns that are not captured by, so that was your whirlwind tour through sentential logic. We didn't really get all that deeply into it, but I thought it might be useful to see those argument forms. And I'll do, in the exercises today, you'll play with them just a little bit. But there are a lot more deductively valid argument forms than just those. Sentential logic is the absolute simplest version of it. There are argument forms that include things like quantification, so all things that are F are G, or some things that are F are G. There are things like modal logic, where you say necessarily if P then Q. There are things like temporal logics. There are things like deontic logics that talk about duties. So there's a million more deductive argument forms that we're not going to talk about in this class. You can get a lot more of them in PHL247, Modern Symbolic Logic. And it keeps going from there. So that gives you like the central basics of deductively valid argument forms, from which there are, after that class, a zillion more. And logicians keep coming up with more and more axiomatized logical systems every day. So identifying more and more deductively valid argument forms. For the purposes of this class, that should be plenty. And for the purposes of the rest of your life, probably you're going to spend most of your time not doing deductively valid arguments. And most of the arguments we're going to deal with for the rest of this class are not going to be deductively valid, precisely because of this clause perfectly here. So if P then Q, P therefore Q, really only provides a deductive reason to believe Q if P and Q are just exactly the same words, right? It's got to be an exact match. So if you have to fudge it at all, if you have to shift slightly the way it's phrased in order to get it into this form, you have not got a deductive argument form, right? And so that's what we're going to do for the rest of this lecture. This is going to be a short lecture, but talk about shifting things slightly, fudging things slightly. So this is the last bit of argument mapping we're going to do. Finally, after this class, you will have learned all of the skills relevant for argument mapping, and then we'll have the midterm, and then we'll get on to assessing these arguments that you've mapped. So far what you've learned is how to take an argument, break it down into its parts, and see how the parts are related. And using that skill, we're going to start building up the skill of assessing whether it's a good argument. So assessing whether the premises are true, whether the inferences follow, and all that stuff. So one last set of skills before we're done this, though. Striking out non-premises. So I'd like you to look at this and figure out, of these, so there's premises, there's a conclusion, which of these are not premises? Like which are not playing a role in the argument as presented? My neighbors left their lights on again. What jerks? When you leave the lights on, it attracts bugs. Man, I hate bugs, and they're going to come from far and wide. Yeah. The second sentence, what jerks? Is not really an argument. Yeah, and there's probably another one. Yeah?
Oh, I hate bugs.
I hate bugs. Yeah. So now, those are not arguments. Those are not premises given a certain conclusion. So what's the conclusion that you guys have in mind here?
That the bugs are going to come.
Yeah. Yeah. So if bugs are going to show up from far and wide is the conclusion, then things like what jerks and man, I hate bugs are clearly not premises. Maybe you could cook up a way to make them premises given some other conclusion. But given that's the conclusion, those are just not contributing to, see, they're not inferentially relevant to believing the conclusion. Yeah?
What if you had jerks as their jerkiness as the conclusion?
As the conclusion.
Hatred for bugs as the premise word?
Excellent, excellent. So yes, if the conclusion of this argument is that my neighbors are jerks, then you hating bugs and therefore them aggravating you is inferentially relevant. So it depends on what the conclusion is. This is part of what we'd like to get across here. That's excellent. So like, I assumed that the conclusion of this was they're going to come from far and wide, in which case those sentences are just sort of like verbal add-ons. They're rhetorical flourishes. They're things that you would just say because you're feeling them, something like that. But yeah, if the point of the argument is just to prove that they're jerks, then maybe they could be relevant. Yeah.
You said that there's a possibility that you get, I guess, arguments that have multiple conclusions.
Yeah.
If we diagrammed in that way, like that this one had multiple conclusions, would we be able to make a case for it being right?
Sure. Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm not going to give you. So the ones I believe that on the midterm at least there's going to be no non-premises in the thing. I'm just going to give you premises in conclusion. So there's going to be nothing for you to strike out. So you won't have to do this process, and it will be pretty obvious what the conclusion is. So you're not. I'm not trying to like give you this really complicated thing. But on the later assignment, so on the argument analysis, if you're reading like a newspaper editorial, it'll be genuinely ambiguous what the conclusion exactly is supposed to be, and that makes the question of what is or isn't a premise an open question. So you can, depending on how you interpret the point of the piece of writing, there could be one conclusion, there could be multiple conclusions, and different things will appear as premises or as non-premises. But I wanted to kind of really call attention to this because in the argument now, I'm sorry I keep, these poor people from last semester, but I keep ragging on them. But last semester we had people do argument analyses, and they would go through and treat every single sentence as a premise, as an independent premise. Right? They had no filters for saying, that's just something they're saying, or that's just a repetition of a premise that you see elsewhere. So lots of times you'll see a premise happen 2 or 3 times, and it's really the same idea, but they're repeating it for effect, for rhetorical sort of quality, and all that stuff, for emphasis. So, you know, this is the last stage of argument mapping where you're saying, okay, I'm going to filter through this bit of writing and only focus on things that have the right kind of relation. So things that are supposed to be there in order to make you believe the conclusion. All right. So, and rephrasing to match is the other sort of bit of this. So in this one we say, my neighbors left their lights on again. When you leave the lights on, it attracts bugs, and they're going to come from far and wide. So when you're phrasing your premises, just kind of clean up the sentence a little. You take away the ands and the therefores and the differences in phrasing. So my neighbors left their lights on again. When you leave the lights on, it attracts bugs. And then the conclusion, instead of saying they and are going to come from far and wide. So come from far and wide, I take it, is close enough to will be attracted that you can just say, these are equivalent. And now you have a clear version of an argument that you can recognize the form of, right? So instead of having different ways of phrasing the same thing, you've got the same thing in something like, so the lights are on. If the lights are on, it attracts bugs. Therefore, bugs will be attracted. Now it's modus ponens. Now it's a deductively valid argument. Because what you've done is taken away the things that weren't premises and rephrased the premises in a way that displays their sort of relation to each other, their clear relation to each other. Okay? And when you're looking at arguments in the wild, probably you're not going to write it all out, but this should be happening in your head. Right? This should be happening in order for you to see the structure of the argument. You should be making these connections between the different premises and which parts are equivalent. Now, and it might not always be totally clear what phrases are equivalent. This is a judgment call that you have to make in your everyday argumentative practices. Okay, let's do another. So, nobody should have to suffer through a class this boring. This is just terrible. Dull stuff makes you unhappy, and unhappiness can shorten your lifespan. Everyone has a right to live a long, full life, so no one should have to put up with this. Okay, so the strategy is first try to figure out what is the conclusion that this is going to try to prove. So that's a first step in any argument analysis. Identify the conclusion. So what's the conclusion of this argument? Yeah.
Dull stuff makes you unhappy and happiness makes you lifespan.
No, I think so. So this is it's tricky, but yeah. So I would have said that the first sentence is the conclusion, because dull stuff can make you unhappy, and unhappiness can shorten your lifespan, and everyone has a right to a long lifespan. So no one should have to put up with this. These all seem like reasons. Sorry, no one should have to put up with this could also be the conclusion. So the first and the last sentence seem to me like pretty much equivalent ways of saying the same thing, and everything else stands as reasons for believing those things. Yeah?
So could you actually effectively strike out the last sentence and just keep the first?
Yeah.
And just
Yeah. Good. So here's what I would have done. Yeah, exactly that. So I would say this is just terrible. This is a super easy one to tell that you should be striking out, right? Because you're just verbally, you're just going, and yeah, I would strike out the final one, essentially because you're just repeating what's in the first sentence. So it's a different way of putting the first sentence. And as you're trying to see the structure of these arguments, it's really helpful to strike away repetition. Yeah?
Couldn't the whole thing be an argument for the line that you striked out?
So no one should have to put up with this. So, yeah, right, so.
No, the first, this is terrible.
Oh, this is just terrible. Yeah, okay, so, yeah.
Well, you could strike that out because it's kind of almost duplicating what you said in the first sentence and last in some sense. Like,
Yeah. Yeah, so if you're going to fill out the this in that this, it probably needs to be replaced with, you know, this class or something like that. So it's all three of those are essentially just saying the same thing, like this class sucks. Right? Okay, so you've found repetitions in here. There's sentences that are just saying the same thing, or sentences that aren't actively acting as, you know, just saying this is terrible is not really a reason to believe anything. It's just you complaining. Just pure complaints aren't really reasons to believe anything else. They might be conclusions, but they're not really good premises. So it's either this is just terrible is either the conclusion, in which case is pretty much equivalent to the first and the last sentence, or it's a non-premise. Okay. So I would rephrase like this. And you can see that I've taken out the thes and the therefore, or sort of the therefores and the so's and the becauses, because those are the kind of connectives that relate these premises. So this class is dull. Things which make you that are dull make you unhappy. Therefore, things this class will make you unhappy. A nice modus ponens again. Unhappiness can shorten your lifespan, so this class will shorten your lifespan. Again, P3 and P4 do a nice, you do the puzzle piece test on these and see that they're dependent reasons for believing P5. P6 gives you a moral premise. It is wrong to shorten people's lifespans. And then P5 and P6 give you dependent reasons for believing the conclusion. Another thing I'll just very briefly flag. Another thing that I've been doing throughout this class is throwing in shoulds and oughts without really like making a big deal about them. We'll talk after the midterm about normative premises. This is a premise about what should be the case or what ought to be the case. And you can't really get, so previously I would say just P5, this class will shorten your lifespan, therefore it's wrong to make people take this class. But that's not really you need an extra principle in there. You need a moral ought premise in there to get there. Don't worry about it right now, but I haven't brought your attention to it yet because most people most of the time just go so smoothly from things that are obviously like unpleasant to you shouldn't do that. But we'll bring it into, again, these are all processes that you do really smoothly and naturally without thinking about them, and we're trying to slow them down, bring them into conscious awareness so that you can see how they work in a kind of bit-by-bit way. That's another one. We'll do normative principles, so that how do you get a should out of a bunch of facts? Anyway. Okay. Fairly clear what's going on here? So you take a piece of text, you say, okay, what is this text? What is the main thing this text is trying to convince me of? And then you strike out anything that's not a reason for believing that thing. You strike out repetition, and you strike out, like anything that's sort of just repeated. And then you try to list it as premises, sort of cleaning up the premises as you go. So how did I put this? So nobody should have to suffer through a class this boring is kind of the conclusion. And it contains both the conclusion and a premise. So that this class is dull is part of the premises. And dull things make you unhappy. So dull stuff makes you unhappy. Unhappiness can shorten your lifespan. So I've taken dull stuff can make you happy and unhappiness can shorten your lifespan and taken out the and here. So this class will shorten your lifespan. I should have taken out the so as well, just to kind of get it really crisp what's going on. Okay? Okay. One more, and then we'll take a break and do exercises. This will be a fairly short class today. So, well, it's got to be Tom or Elizabeth for this job. Let's try to figure out who it should be, shall we? I say you can't trust somebody who doesn't show their emotions, and Tom is completely unemotional. So I'm not sure he's right for the position. I really think we should go with somebody else to be safe, and that just leaves Elizabeth. So there you have it. Okay, so what's the conclusion? Start from this. Identify the thing that it's trying to convince you of. Oh, you will answer all the questions. Somebody else. What's your name, by the way? I'm sorry. Luke. Luke answers all the questions. Somebody other than Luke answers this one. So what's the conclusion of this one? Thank you for participating, by the way, Luke. I really appreciate it. Yeah.
Elizabeth was the right choice.
Good. Right. So I would say that strikes me as just the clear conclusion of this. You're trying to figure out, they're trying to convince you who should get the job, and the conclusion is Elizabeth should get the job. So what's not a premise? Oh, okay. Luke, yeah.
I just have a question. The conclusion kind of feels like 2 lines, but you can put them together, because that just leaves Elizabeth kind of feels fragmented.
How do you, so, oh, and that just leaves Elizabeth, yeah.
It doesn't imply that that's the choice that you have it until they say, so there you have it.
Right, right. So you should rephrase this. I think that what that shows is that you should rephrase these 2 sentences into one big conclusion, and so Elizabeth should get the job. So that's the kind of rephrasing that would be helpful in order to make the structure totally transparent. Okay, so what would you just strike out? What would you strike right out of this? Yeah.
The question?
The question.
Let's try to figure out who it should be, shall we?
Yeah, yeah.
Like it's kind of, first of all, that's not saying anything. It's just question.
Right, yeah. Yeah, so it's not part of the question it's somewhat rhetorical and you're kind of setting the topic, but it's not giving you a reason to believe something. Yeah, yeah.
Could you strike out, I really think that we should go with someone else to be safe because it really only gives you 2 options, Tom or Elizabeth?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I think that is something that you would want to strike out. Yeah. Yes, exactly. So let's try to figure out who it should be, shall we? And I really think we should go someone else to be safe. And I struck out, so there you have it. But I think Luke is right that it's kind of just combines with, and that just leaves Elizabeth. So there you have it as kind of the QED, the quad erat demonstrandum. Yeah.
So I'm not sure you're right for the position. Is that important? There's only 2 choices, so, and you already said that if you doesn't trust someone, you can show emotions, and Tom is emotional.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So.
saying, is that really important?
Yeah. So it depends on how you're rephrasing it. Whether so, I'm not sure he's right for the position is important. I kind of read that as a sub conclusion. So you say Tom or Elizabeth, not Tom, therefore Elizabeth. So that's the not Tom part of the inference as I read it. Yeah? Okay. So rewrite it in sort of like relatively cleaned up form, and then clean it up even more. Either Tom or Elizabeth will get this job. You can't trust somebody who doesn't show their emotions. Tom doesn't show his emotions, so you can't trust Tom. And implicitly, I would say, there's an implicit premise here that you should only give jobs to people you trust. Right? That was the sort of implied part of this argument. You say, I'm not sure Tom's right for this job. He doesn't show his emotions, and you can't trust people like that. Implied is that you shouldn't give jobs to people you don't trust. Right? So it's kind of hidden premise in this thing, and you'll have to do this as we go along. Supply premises that without which the argument wouldn't work. Right? It's not an additional reason that the argument didn't supply. It's just sort of an assumed thing that's hanging in the background. So without that premise, you don't get the inference from not trusting to not getting the job, right? If it's not the case that you should only give jobs to people that you trust, then whether you trust this guy has no relation to whether you should give him the job. So this is a hidden premise or a missing premise in this argument. Therefore, Elizabeth should get the job. Yeah.
Do you have to write you shouldn't give Tom the job based off of P4 and P5 because they give you that conclusion or sub-conclusion?
Yeah, I think you should have. Yeah, I think I should have put that in sort of P6. So P4, you can't trust jobs. Tom, P5, you should only give jobs to people you trust. So if you give a job, then you should trust. You can't trust, therefore you shouldn't get the job. So there's a hidden P6 there. That's exactly right. Yeah, there's a P6 there that says, don't give the job to Tom, and then that combines with P1 that says Tom or Elizabeth, not Tom, therefore Elizabeth. Right? Yeah.
In the context of the midterm, will we have to include P5, like the hidden
No,
context?
definitely not. Definitely not. All of the premises will be supplied. Everything that will be supplied is a premise. All right? I'll triple check that that's the case, but I've double checked already. I'll triple check that that's the case. But for the sake, so we're going beyond today we're going beyond what's on the midterm. The midterm is the level of complexity that we did yesterday, where all the things that were supplied are premises or conclusions. Only the things that are supplied are premises and conclusions. So that's what you'll be dealing with on Monday. This is what you're going to be dealing with literally for the rest of your life when you're trying to figure out what people are saying, because a great deal of what people mean goes unsaid, essentially. Yeah.
So this whole notion of like hidden premises, it seems to me that we're trying to add them in so that the argument, because we identify the conclusion before we identify hidden premises.
Yeah.
So it seems almost like we're trying to shove in some extra piece of logic that then gets to our premise, to our conclusion.
That's right. So according to the principle of charity, we add missing premises without which the argument wouldn't work. So especially if they're plausible, and like I take it that everybody here would agree that you shouldn't give jobs to people you don't trust. Does that seem like it should be just sort of totally obvious, like this person's untrustworthy, implies that you shouldn't give them a job that people are competing for. If they're the only ones, then sure, give them the job, but there's two people here, so yeah.
That implies your trust is, or your mistrust is well placed, or
yeah, maybe your trust is misplaced or comes from a bad place, but even then, you're still going to think that's still a reason for you to believe, as this misguided person, that you shouldn't give them the job. So, yeah. Anyway, so that's the missing premises are the ones that are just really obvious and really acceptable, and without which the argument wouldn't work. It's tempting to add missing premises that just like come out of left field and just make the argument stronger on the behalf of the person doing the argument, but don't do that. Only add in missing premises when it's like obvious that the argument can't work without it, and furthermore, it's obvious that everybody should believe it, something like that. And it should be obvious to all of you that this is getting to be more art than science, right? The interpretation of arguments, the determination of what counts as a conclusion and what counts as a premise will get less and less formal as we go along, unfortunately. So I hope you enjoyed that sentential logic stuff, because it's the clearest stuff that we're going to do for the entire rest of the course. Everything after this is going to be less and less formal and more sort of ambiguous and dependent on your capacity to use common sense, a modicum of compassion, and sort of generosity and interpretation in order to figure out what's going on. Some of you will find that to be heartening and enlightening, and some of you find that to be just gross and kind of icky. But nonetheless, we'll all soldier on together. All right?